Welcome back. As you probably remember, in some of our earlier lectures, we studied the basic elements of effective written arguments, and we learned how we could incorporate those elements into our own work to become more successful at persuading readers to see things from our point of view. We began, appropriately enough, by studying introductions. We examined various strategies for crafting a powerful opening to an argument, and we learned how to establish a primary thesis and then lay the groundwork for later development of key terms and concepts. We shifted our attention then from crafting introductions to organizing an argument as a whole, and we examined methods that you can use to guide your readers from point to point while never losing sight of your primary claim. After our survey of organizational methods and strategies, we moved on to a discussion of the ways good writers support their arguments, specifically how they could establish the relevance and the validity of their evidence, and explain how the proof they've chosen adds weight or power to their claims. Finally, in the last lecture of that argumentative series, we turned our attention to conclusions. We discussed the importance of providing a brief summary of an argument's main thesis and its key points, and we also looked at several other ways conclusions can help strengthen an argument, whether by outlining the positive or the negative consequences of accepting or rejecting a particular set of claims, or maybe by demonstrating a lack of viable alternatives to one's own point of view. After we finished our argumentative series, we went back a little bit and spent some time with poetry and with drama and talked about how using elements of those types of writing could help make your arguments more powerful. So now, with this lecture, we begin a two-part examination of the value of autobiographical writing. And we'll be studying several extremely powerful tools that autobiographers use to achieve their writing goals. Our ultimate aim today is to learn how those tools work and how we can incorporate them into our own writing. Now, whether you're crafting an online personal profile, professional bio blurb, or a job application letter, the challenges of creating a written self-portrait that are going to help you achieve your goals can be really daunting. What details of your life should be included? What experiences and qualities should you highlight? And what approaches are most effective? When should you give a whole lot of detail? And when should you hold something back? For example, if you're writing something about your own life, a mention of the fact that you climbed Mount Rainier might be worthy of inclusion in a whole lot of different writing scenarios. You could argue that the fact that you are a mountain climber gives us a little clue about your personality, and in most situations, this information is going to work to your advantage. It's like a shorthand way of saying, I'm tough, I'm up for a challenge, I have determination. At the same time, with a few possible exceptions, we don't want to hear a long narrative about how long and hard you trained for that climb, or how tired you felt during it, or how exhilarated you were after completing it. So today we're going to talk about knowing when, what, and how much to say when you're engaged in writing about yourself. Through careful analysis of excerpts from the autobiography of one of America's most famous and highly successful individuals, and this is Benjamin Franklin, this lecture is going to show you several strategies that you can use when you're faced with a writing task or an occasion that demands that you give us some form of self-presentation or representation. We're going to look at ways to apply these strategies in any situation that requires you to construct a personal narrative or to convey some kind of information about yourself to a reader or readers. In particular, you're going to learn how to use that really valuable tool, the personal anecdote. And the personal anecdote is really an essential building block for all great autobiographies. We're going to talk about how you can catch and hold the attention of readers while simultaneously enhancing your credibility through the use of anecdotes. You're also going to learn how to avoid the pitfalls caused by what I like to refer to as TMI, too much information. Giving someone too much information can alienate your audience and end up preventing you from reaching whatever the objective is that you were going for with this piece of writing. Successful autobiographical writing is kind of like being the favorite guest at a dinner party. You have great stories to tell, but they don't go on too long, and your stories make the other people at the dinner table feel included. They're able to relate to something you say, or they feel that your sharing of a story from your past is a way of trying to connect with them, and it's not just an attempt on your part to shine a spotlight on yourself and say, hey everyone, listen to how fantastic I am. Personal anecdotes from successful autobiographers can be wonderfully instructive because they show us exactly how to self-promote without sounding shallow and how you can describe your best qualities without coming across as arrogant. And arrogant and shallow are two things that you never want to convey when you're writing about yourself. And as we'll see, when it comes to autobiographical writing, the best way to be effective is to be selective. Let me say that one more time. The best way to be effective is to be selective. So let me show you what I mean by taking an anecdote from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And here's what he says, quote, I disliked the trade and had a strong inclination for the sea, but my father declared against it. However, living near the water, I was much in and about it, learned early to swim well and to manage boats, and when in a boat or canoe with other boys, I was commonly allowed to govern, especially in any case of difficulty, and upon other occasions I was generally a leader among the boys, and sometimes led them into scrapes, of which I will mention one instance, as it shows an early projecting public spirit, though not then justly conducted. Okay, the strategy Franklin's using here in this anecdote is one that I like to call IAA. So I use an acronym to sort of remember it. And this stands for Interests, Abilities, and Achievements, IAA. It's a shorthand way of reminding yourself, and that's how I remind myself and my students, that most occasions that call for autobiographical writing require us to describe or to address at least one and sometimes all three of these areas. What our interests are, so there's the I. What abilities we have that may be related to those interests, there's the first A. And what goals we may have achieved that are relative to these interests and abilities, there's the second A, IAA. I want to point out how Franklin begins by telling us something about his general affinity for water and boat-related activities. And also, by way of contrast, he's not terribly interested in becoming, say, a formal apprentice for, say, a conventional trade. In this case, this would have been something like candle making or soap making, and that's initially what his father wanted him to do. And as Franklin tells us, this was not something he was at all interested in. I mean, really, can you blame young Benjamin Franklin for preferring not to take up an occupation like this? We can also glean from this really brief anecdote that Franklin is presenting himself as someone whose interests blend pretty well with his abilities. He has an affinity for the ocean, which leads him, as he says, to learn to swim well when he's young, and he has an, quote, inclination for the sea, which results in his ability to manage boats. Although he's got a facility for things aquatic and nautical, the straightforward way in which he presents this information doesn't come across as bragging or boasting, but rather it's a simple statement of fact. What really stands out, even in this very short piece of autobiographical writing, is a sense of overall unity of interests and activities. We get the idea that Franklin's natural inclinations and affinities both lead to and mesh with the skill set he's developing, even at a very young age. And the skills he's developing, they seem to be pointing towards something that has to do with being a leader. So what he's doing with this anecdote is setting the stage for future events that are undoubtedly going to be a really important part of his autobiography. So from the beginning, he has a focus that's guiding him as he selects which stories and which events to tell that will relate or be interesting to his readership. So, as we can see, this anecdote includes just enough detail to give us a sense that Franklin is pretty good at what he does, and that he's managed to parlay the connection between his interests and his abilities into some concrete and relatively impressive achievements. As he tells us, when he found himself in a boat with other boys, he was, quote, commonly allowed to govern, especially in any case of difficulty. And naturally enough, his achievements as a sort of proto-ship captain are what set him up for a broader and more general position of leadership among his peers, especially later in his life. Another thing that makes us really like the Benjamin Franklin of this anecdote is that he's also kind of self-deprecating. He acknowledges that he was somewhat of a mischief maker when he says, I was generally a leader among the boys and sometimes led them into scrapes, of which I will mention one instance. As it shows, and this is important, as it shows an early projecting public spirit, though not then justly conducted. In other words, Franklin's saying, I was no angel, and let me tell you about one of the stunts I pulled, acknowledging his own shortcomings. But at the same time, what he's doing is pointing out that when marshaled or directed in the right way or direction, his early mischievous inclinations and actions could actually be used to eventually get some positive outcomes. Now, if you were a corporate headhunter or a hiring coordinator looking for someone to fill a management position, Franklin, even at 10 years old, would present himself as a pretty good-looking candidate for the job. And in fact, that's really not too far from what Franklin himself was aiming for when he crafted this autobiographical anecdote. I mean, he's not precisely going after a management position, but he was trying to explain after the fact how his early interests and skills eventually led him to achieve the kind of power and influence that most of us associate with Franklin and his legacy today. And because most of us today tend really only to think of Franklin as one of the founding fathers, as a kind of elder statesman figure, this passage about some of his youthful escapades provides us with a deeper and more interesting picture of him than what most history books record. And it probably also makes us like him a little bit more than we did before we knew this story. As I mentioned earlier, most occasions that call for autobiographical writing, whether they're job application letters or requests to your boss for a raise or a promotion, a personal information profile for a company newsletter, or it could be a blurb for an online career or social networking site. Each of these situations requires you to provide a description of yourself that deals with the three areas of interest, ability, and achievement. Again, IAA. And I like to call this, when we're thinking of it generally, the IAA umbrella, because a lot of stuff comes under that heading, the IAA. The autobiographical narrative you present will be most effective if, like Franklin, you choose information that can be categorized as belonging to either the I, the A, or the other A, so it's under this umbrella. In other words, if you happen to be a doctor, the simple fact that you had a pet dog does not really count as an ability or an achievement. And it's not an interest that's particularly noteworthy. So it might not have a place in a piece of autobiographical writing that you're producing. But things change if, when you were 7, you found an injured dog lying by the side of the road and you nursed it back to health, and this is what set you on the road to working in the medical profession. Well then, yes, that would fit nicely, very nicely, into our IAA classification. And as long as we're having fun with acronyms, let me point out another benefit of restricting the range of your autobiographical writing to specific interests, abilities, and achievements. Focusing on IAA, or more specifically, what types of interests, ability, or accomplishment, this information, trying to figure out what's most relevant to a particular autobiographical writing task, this is going to help you avoid that TMI problem, too much information. TMI, too much information, is one of the most common and devastating mistakes you can make in a situation that calls for written self-presentation. Too much information, offering more to your readers than what they need or they want, this is going to make the rest of your writing seem irrelevant or uninteresting and detract from whatever your main goal was in writing the piece to start with. Again, let's think about that hypothetical dinner party. Isn't there always someone at those parties who tells you way too much about him or herself? In my case, I always seem to get into a conversation with someone who thinks that his or her latest medical issue is a fascinating topic for dinner table conversation. Now, your reader or your dinner party guest might be interested to know that you just had gallbladder surgery, but they really don't need a blow-by-blow of the diagnosis, the treatment, and the recovery. Unless, of course, the anecdote about the diagnosis, the treatment, and the recovery is hysterically funny, which somehow I doubt would ever be the case in a situation like this one. But I hold out the possibility that perhaps it could be good dinner table conversation if the right person's telling the story. But that's not 99% of us, so don't go there. When faced with the often daunting prospect of writing about your life in order to achieve a specific goal, it's all too easy to respond by just pushing as much information as you can at your readers. Job application letters that should be a page and a half end up running 4 or 5 pages long. Resumes that should be 2 pages at most somehow end up looking like the Oxford English Dictionary. And biographical profiles on a website that are meant to be no more than a paragraph or 2, well, sometimes you can see these balloon to twice or even 3 times that size. You need to give your readers only the most important, pertinent details up front. If they want to know more, they know how to find you. Trying to make yourself look more competent or qualified by padding your resume or job application letter with a lot of extra information is really only going to make you look like you're padding your resume or job letter. I recently had the opportunity to attend a lecture by an amazing scholar in one of my areas of intellectual interest, and the talk itself turned out to be great. It was really actually spectacular and a very rewarding presentation. But the overall experience was really almost ruined by the fact that the person who gave the introduction took 25 minutes to recount the speaker's activities and accomplishments, while the speaker herself actually ended up talking only for about 35 minutes. Again, it was a fantastic lecture, but the person who wrote and presented the introduction was obviously suffering from a seriously acute case of TMI, an inability to recognize the difference between a useful amount of personal description and a flood of biographical details that really didn't do anything but distract the members of the audience, who got more and more irritated that they were sitting here and being prevented from hearing the speaker they actually had come to hear. So, in addition to always keeping in mind the need to confine your autobiographical writing to the realm of IAA and keep that material as specific and as relevant as possible, what else can you do to avoid the problems associated with TMI, or a more general problem of unfocused or kind of random, haphazard self-presentation? Well, your autobiographical self-presentation is going to be much more powerful if, again, like Franklin, you offer a narrative that is both progressive and unified. Okay, so what do I mean by progressive and unified? By that I mean you start with a description of your interests. You then show how those interests are tied to your individual skills and talents, and then finally, how those skills and talents have resulted in particular achievements and accomplishments that make you very well suited for whatever larger goal it is you're trying to achieve, whether that means getting a job, getting a raise or promotion, or simply getting yourself noticed by the right people, either socially or professionally, or both. All too often, when faced with the task of writing something autobiographical, people tend to try and begin at the beginning and then move in chronological fashion until they get to the end. And if you're actually writing a proper autobiography, and here what I mean is something like a book-length treatment of your life, this is probably the best way to structure the thing, generally speaking. The reader can follow your chronology if you start at the beginning and go to the end. But even in a longer work like this, an anecdote drawn from any point in your life can work as a really interesting and engaging starting point. It can give us a preview. It can shed light on who you are, who you became, before we go on and read about the process of that becoming. And if the anecdote is compelling enough, then we might be totally willing to wade through some relatively uninteresting stuff about your childhood just so we can get to the main matter of your life that produced the you that did something so interesting. While none of the three areas I've been discussing, interests, abilities, and achievements, IAA, is inherently more important than another when it comes to writing about who you are and what you've done, it's also crucial to recognize that for most of us, in most writing situations, how we present our achievements and accomplishments is the thing that's going to matter most. For an example of how to approach this aspect of autobiographical writing, let's take a look at another excerpt from Franklin. He tells another story in which he says, "There was a salt marsh that bounded part of the mill pond, on the edge of which, at high water, we used to stand to fish for minnows. By much trampling, we had made it a mere quagmire. My proposal was to build a wharf there fit for us to stand upon, and I showed my comrades a large heap of stones, which were intended for a new house near the marsh, and which would very well suit our purpose. Accordingly, in the evening, when the workmen were gone, I assembled a number of my playfellows, and working with them diligently like so many emmets, sometimes 2 or 3 to a stone, we brought them all away and built our little wharf." Okay, so this anecdote is entertaining just as it is instructive. But I think for our purposes, it's better for us to try and focus at the moment on the instructive elements, specifically the way that Franklin is presenting his achievements. In particular, I want to point out the balance he strikes between individual accomplishments and a collaborative group effort. This may seem to be a totally minor point, but it matters a great deal when your writing goal is to convey your accomplishments without seeming arrogant or overblown. I have had the opportunity to look at hundreds of job application letters and resumes, those of my students, those of people who are applying for jobs at the institutions where I've worked, and it never fails to amaze me how often an applicant will overemphasize her or his individual achievements and totally fail to properly or effectively describe collaborative or group-based accomplishments. This is especially puzzling and distressing to me because if you take a moment to reflect on the process of autobiographical writing, you'll see that it's not such a terribly difficult balance to maintain. As we see in that passage from Franklin, one of the most powerful and relatively easy tactics a writer can employ in autobiographical situations is to alternate the use of personal pronouns so as to provide a mix of I and we statements or I and we descriptions. If you look and listen closely to Franklin, you'll notice that even in this brief anecdote, he strikes a nearly even balance between the use of we or our and I and my pronouns. For example, consider that last line again. He says, "In the evening, when the workmen were gone, I assembled a number of my playfellows, and working with them diligently, like so many emmets, sometimes 2 or 3 to a stone, we brought them all the way and built our little wharf. In fact, if you go so far as to tally up the numbers in the passage as a whole, you'll find that Franklin uses approximately 5, I think it is, we or our pronouns for every 3 I or me pronouns. In other words, his larger strategy is to foreground his individual achievements, but he does this always in relationship to the larger group of which he's a member. Now, it'd be overly simplistic to say that Franklin's approach is a version of that classic sports cliche, there is no I in team. Right? We've all heard that plenty of times. And anyone who studies Franklin's life learns quickly that he's not a person who ever lacked self-confidence. Indeed, you could say that he had one of the most, shall we say, robust egos of any man of his age. But when it comes to autobiographical writing, he recognized and he took seriously the need to place his individual accomplishments within a larger collective framework. Another benefit of associating or embedding your individual activities and achievements within a larger group context is the opportunity to more effectively represent yourself by selectively describing your faults and your virtues, or to be more accurate, choosing to include faults that could be interpreted as virtues in the making. So let's look back one more time at Franklin's description of his effort to organize his friends to help borrow stones that are supposed to be building a new house. And he gets his friends to help him move the stones meant for the house and turn it into a wharf so that they can have an easier place for minnow fishing. Now, of course the boys are caught, and this is not least of all because the workmen could probably see exactly where the stones had gone. Oh, they were here, and now they're over here making a wharf. Franklin goes on to tell us that all the boys are punished by their fathers, and Franklin's own father reportedly told him that nothing was useful which was not honest. We can see how Franklin presents himself as having an abundance of natural talent, and all he needs, all that's required, is some guidance and some maturing on his part so that the potential he has can be properly realized. Note also that the number of positive qualities he manages to associate himself with include things like initiative, creativity, ambition, management skills, the ability to work hard and to collaborate with others. Essentially, he's presented himself as a kind of diamond in the rough. Now, I'm not suggesting that your next job letter should include a story such as this from your own childhood, but I do want you to understand how powerful this strategy can be, especially if you're following Franklin's example of presenting faults that could easily be interpreted as maybe sometime down the road becoming strengths. If you do this, you manage to avoid coming across as arrogant while still showing yourself in a really positive light. Part of what's so appealing about Franklin's account of his youthful activities is that he's cheerfully acknowledging his early mischief-making, and he's not attempting to excuse it, he's not trying to explain it away. He's letting you know what he did when he was a kid. And while you probably don't want to spend too much time on the things you did that were wrong, or the pranks that you pulled, or anything else that could be considered a weakness or a failing, being able to laugh at yourself is a really attractive quality. And that's part of what Franklin is doing here, and part of what makes his anecdotes so appealing. So what have we gained from studying Benjamin Franklin's approach to autobiographical writing? Well, first, we learned the value of confining your personal information to just 3 key areas, and these are interest, abilities, and achievements, IAA. Remember also that your autobiographical writing will be that much more powerful and persuasive if you can find a way to connect your individual accomplishments to a broader collaborative effort. Practice using the I, we, and my, our pronoun configurations to strike a balance between self-promotion and associating yourself with a group or groups. And finally, try presenting your faults or your failures as part of a larger process of self-development. In other words, cast them as indications of talent you had that was initially simply misdirected or not fully realized. Put it another way, follow Franklin's lead and make sure your vices appear more like virtues in the making. In our next lecture, we'll continue to talk about autobiography and explore how this kind of writing can be used to establish yourself as a leader or authority figure. We'll talk some more about Benjamin Franklin and also about Frederick Douglass, the former slave who wrote his way to an incredibly important position of authority. His writing is some of the finest you will ever encounter in the specific subcategory of autobiography.